All right, super important topic today. This might be honestly might be the most important video that I do this entire time. So I want to talk to you about the philosophy of mixing, and more importantly, like what that means to Fresh Life and what the sound could be like for all the campuses. Because obviously the point of these videos is to kind of bring everybody to a more uniform place, I guess, where everybody's kind of doing the same things. So in order for that to really work, we would have to know what is the actual end goal, what are we looking for when we're mixing. So there's a couple practical things that we've talked about, like for example, that your faders aren't going to always be in the same exact spot. It's not so much about like, oh, I've got to make sure the keys are right here in this exact spot every single week, or that kind of a thing. It's not really that. It's way more about the feeling. And so I want you to think with me and transition your mind with me into thinking about feeling, rather than thinking about like, oh, my fader should be right here, I should use this exact EQ every week, that kind of stuff, because that's really not what we're looking for. Honestly, in any live sound environment, that's really not what you're looking for, but especially here, because we're really working on creating an atmosphere. So that was the first thing I wanted to say, is that the ultimate goal is that you want to fill the room, because you are responsible for creating an atmosphere and a feeling of worship. I was talking to someone a couple weeks ago about this, and they were saying like, if everything we do is so on brand, if everything we do is so, Fresh Life is branded on everything that we have, then our sound should be exactly the same way. And I totally agree with that our sound should try to be the same. So the ultimate goal of this sound is that you want to fill the room. You don't want to leave any kind of transparency. You don't want to feel like that you're not creating that atmosphere, which a way of not doing that would be, not adding any kind of effects in, everything sounding really dry, not having the volumes correct, like just things that make the room feel empty, things that make the room feel thin and transparent. That's not what you want. You want as full of a sounding mix as you can, and as much atmosphere, I'm gonna keep using that word because it's really important, as much of that as you can get into the mix. So there's practical ways to go about that, but I want, for this part of this video, I want that to be considered like we're calling it the philosophy of mixing, so I want it to be considered like the feeling side of it, rather than exactly what you should be doing on the board. So the thing about this is that it's not going to happen on accident. Creating this kind of an atmosphere doesn't just come about like that. It really is intentional, and so this is something that you, as a sound engineer, this is kind of on your shoulders, to create this and to make sure that you are sustaining this as well. So take that seriously. I mean, this is a part of worship. This is a part of people having these experiences that we want them here for. This is a part of people, a lot of times this is a part of people coming to know Jesus, is just this atmosphere, this feeling of just worshipful hearts, and this feeling in the air where people feel comfortable worshiping. This is really important stuff. So the thing about this that we're going to talk about, the first practical thing we're going to talk about, is that you want to fill the whole range of frequencies. So if you recall back to the frequency video that I made earlier, you'll remember that I talked about the human range of hearing being from 20 hertz to 20 kilohertz. I explained hertz, all of that kind of stuff. So you want something to kind of be falling in all of those. And that's how you get like the really full sounding mix. So I want to talk a little bit about this, like in particular, of what this means for each instrument. So I don't know if this is really going to help, but I made this chart. So I'm going to kind of talk while I'm showing you this. Hopefully you can even read this. If it helps, I can actually like post this in the group me or send it to you or something like that. So let me know if you need anything like this. But basically I've written it out from 20 hertz to 20 kilohertz, and I've kind of just made little segments of where everything should be falling at. So your kick and bass should probably be occupying up until about 250 hertz. Pretty much all of your low range is going to be occupied by your kick and bass. Your snare drum, your guitars, all those kind of things, very mid-rangey. Those are going to go from about 500 to about probably 1K or 2K or 2,000. It's probably going to be filled mostly by the sounds of like the snare drums and the guitars. Everything else above that, like everything that gets in the higher frequencies above 2K, so pretty much like 4K up, is going to be your vocals, your keys, your cymbals, your hats, all that kind of stuff. And if you can kind of get those things to fall in those ranges, then you're going to have a much easier time like filling the room, as we said earlier, and making a really full sounding mix. So some good ways to go about that is for everything that's not a bass or the kick drum, I pretty much put a high pass filter on everything. I think I talked about that in the EQ video. I'll definitely talk about it when I make the video actually looking at the EQ on the board. I'll definitely talk about high pass filters and how to use those. So I would put a high pass filter on everything other than the bass and the kick drum up into about like 250 hertz. Maybe for the keys a little bit higher. I'm not gonna like guarantee that, but I'm just gonna say you might want to check that out, because the keys can sound really muddy, because obviously you've got on a keyboard, you've got all the frequencies represented, so playing those lower chords and stuff sometimes can get a really muddy sound, because the point is like you want only the bass and the drum to occupy that particular range, and if other things start to get down there, it gets all mixed up, it doesn't sound good. So that's like one really practical thing you can do. And really just with using the EQs, you just want to make sure that per instrument, kind of like what I was just saying about how those should all occupy those different ranges, you just want to make sure per instrument that your EQ settings are set in a way where like you're boosting the frequencies you want, cutting out the frequencies you don't want. And a lot of times you don't even have to boost anything. You just really need to focus more on cutting out the frequencies you don't want. And something you'll notice too, I just want to like throw this out there just so it doesn't like freak you out. If you go through and like solo everything and you're EQing it, you're gonna have some things that like when you solo them and you're EQing them, they're gonna sound like garbage on their own. They're gonna sound like so bad like when they're soloed, but when they're in the mix with everything, because you're hearing everything at the same time, they're gonna sound like perfect. So be prepared for that a little bit, like with this kind of stuff when you're trying to fill this whole range. If you've got to cut out certain frequencies and instruments and you're listening to it just by itself, you're like, oh, keys sound really weird with this, but you know, you may hear it in the whole mix and it sounds like completely spot on. So the main things, this is a little bit back to the philosophical side, also on the practical side. The main thing that you want to keep in mind is that your kick and bass, like those low frequency sounds, and your vocals are the most important. Part of the, we talked about having a branded sound. Part of that brand is like you want to feel the kick and the bass like in your chest. Like that's a whole part of this like atmospheric feeling, is just like feeling very present, like that kick is like right there. So you want to make sure that the kick and bass are elevated in such a way where they're not overtaking anything, but they're like very much able to be heard. And the thing about, we talked about the frequency range. The thing about that is that also some higher frequency sounds tend to mask lower sounds, so you just have to be careful when you're working with like those mid-range things like guitars and snare drums, and even the higher ranges like vocals and keys. You have to be really careful that those are not masking the sound of the bass and the sound of the kick, because that has a tendency to happen, and you don't want that to happen, because like I said, you want that to be very present. And that's a part of like I talked about full mixes, that's a part of like the full mix, is making sure you can feel the kick and the bass. Also the vocals, you want to make sure that you're hearing the vocals, because there's not much of a point to worship if you can't hear the words that are happening. So voices, bass, and kick, those are the two main things that you always want to stay on top of. Other instruments are obviously important, and that's not meant to say that any of these are more or less important than each other. It's just that when it comes to the feeling, vocals, bass, kick, the most important things. Everything else, you want to be able to hear it, but you're just going to want to make sure, and like I said, you're not going to stick your faders at a certain place and then get rid of them. Or not get rid of them, but then never adjust them again. Like that's not how it works. But you just want to make sure that whatever you're doing, whatever adjustments you're making, you want to make sure you can always hear the kick and the bass. You want to make sure you can always hear the vocals, like intelligibility is important. You want to make sure you can hear what they're saying. Other than that, like you want to be able to hear the keys, you want to be able to hear the guitars, you want to be able to hear the rest of the kit, which I'm imagining is not a problem for most places, because most of the rooms are going to be small enough that you almost don't even have to mic the kit in the first place. But you want to make sure you're hearing the keys and the guitars for sure. But you just want to make sure those are set appropriately so that they're not overtaking the things that you're wanting to feel the most. So effects is another really important part of this. You're probably not going to be working too much with effects on like instruments. Well, compression is not, I wouldn't consider that an effect, but you're going to be working with compressors and EQs obviously, but effects like reverb and delay, that's mostly going to be applied to your vocalists. So that's another thing with reverb and delay. You want to make sure that you're not adding in so much that you can't understand what they're saying, because sometimes you get so much reverb that it's just like it's a constant echo. It's like it never settles, and then you can't even like hear what the person is actually saying. That's annoying. That's not what you want. Your delay, you want to make sure it's on tempo. You want to make sure you're doing the tap tempo, because that's going to keep that's going to make sure that tail is not sounding off, because that could be really distracting. So mixing in those proper effects, and there'll be another video about that. So I know it sounds like some of the stuff sounds like I'm flying through, but there will be a little bit more in-depth videos, especially about effects and EQs and compression and all that kind of stuff. So you don't have to worry too much if you feel like you're a little bit left behind on that right now. But the importance of understanding this is, I want to just recap like the main points. The importance of this is you want to make sure your levels are set correctly, so you're hearing more kick and bass and vocals than you're hearing of, guitar and keys. You want to make sure that you are filling up the whole range of frequencies. So that's filtering, that's EQing. You want to make sure that instruments are falling in their correct place and not overtaking too many different frequency ranges. If you can stay on top of those kind of things and really learn how to master the effects with the voices, honestly, if you can stay on top of those few things and really like learn to just like master those couple things, you're gonna have the sound that Fresh Life is looking for, and you're gonna have the sound that creates that atmosphere. And that's an awesome thing that you get to be a part of as a sound engineer. And it's something that is not, to be honest, it's not gonna get a lot of credit. It's not gonna be something that people are like, wow, you really created a worshipful environment today. Like it's not really how it happens, but it's something that is so important to the entire experience, to the worship experience, and it matters, and you're at the helm of that, and you're the one that is responsible for creating that. Like I said, it happens intentionally, it doesn't happen by accident. So if you can learn to apply these few things, practice these few things, master these few things, you're going to be on track.